I'm conscious that you're eating into your own time for your next workflow. So why don't you give you a chance to talk about preserving legacy digital collections, and then if people have got burning questions from this first, but we might have time to squeeze them in before you have to go at the top of the hour. Are you okay to go straight into the next one?
Yes, thank you. Alrighty. All right, so this project is one I'm currently in the midst of. It's preserving our legacy digital collections. So basically, I'll give the background, but it's collections that existed in UAB libraries, but that were not preserved because we didn't have people really focusing on preservation. So I guess you could call it a little bit of a backlog. So I will start by going through the background of why this project came to be, its scope, and then outlining its goals, and also talking about the questions that I wanted to address, and then going into the workflow and a little bit of project management and lessons learned. All right, gonna move myself away. Okay, so background. So like I said, our department is relatively new. It only started, or it was only created about 3 years ago. But we've had digital collections at UAB libraries since 2006. So before our department was created, between 2006 and 2021, about 30 plus digital collections were created in that time. And on the access side of things, we used OCLC Content DM, and we are currently migrating to Ex Libris's Alma Digital. And so that content built up about 15 external hard drives worth of materials. But that wasn't, at once, it was over time. So we have, very old hard drives to like newer hard drives. And that content was sort of mostly stewarded by our current digital imaging manager. And I like to call her like our OG preservation librarian, because she was really the only one making sure that that was all good. So hats off to her. Her name is Kelly. We love Kelly. So in that time, like I said, it was all built up on hard drives. But in 2017, we purchased a Drobo branded network attached storage server, as you can see here. And copies of the materials that were on those hard drives were put onto the Drobo in a backup share in a folder called Kelly in all caps. So we call it Kelly Backup, or Backup Kelly. And then fast forward to this past year, I was hired in the spring, and Drobo actually went out of business in January 2023. And so that meant they were no longer updating their software or supporting customers. And it also meant that the only way to get to the administrative side of the Drobo is to use their proprietary software. So since they're no longer updating it, that was a risk. And so even though the Drobo is theoretically healthy, you can see it's got all the green lights, it still presented a pretty big risk of this material, especially since the only other copies of it were on aging hard drives. So, and also, it's a side note, we don't put our master copies in the access platform, so it was all like low-level derivatives, so that's obviously not ideal. So this presented a big risk. And so for the scope of the project, it's about 3.6 terabytes of data, so not too much, but I like to say that the scope really shows itself in the fact that the content represents nearly 20 years of work. So if we lost that, that's irreplaceable. And the content is mostly comprised of oral histories, images, videos, and digitized print materials. And like I said, it's well over 30 collections. And another thing to note is our digital collections are more often than not derived from larger physical collections. So to have to go back and redigitize things would be an undertaking, because it's not like everything's in one box for one digital collection. And here's an example of one of our digital collections. We're still in the midst of our migration to Alma Digital, but it gives you an idea of like the different types of content, the variety of content that might be in one singular collection. So the big questions to address, I went over in the last workflow are, typical ape structure, but this is the first time that we were preserving something that wasn't generated in the lab. So we sort of had to ask ourselves, do we preserve things the exact same way? Do we build the packages the same way? Do we, conform to our typical file hierarchy, which is, a flat hierarchy? Do we keep the original names, file names? Do we, update to our file names? And here's an example of our typical file naming convention. It's a UUID appended with a number, and that A at the end indicates it's the master copy. And so when conceiving of this, I initially wanted to tweak the file names to indicate maybe what the files actually represented, because unlike lab generated items where it's just TIFF images of an object, these digital collections will have, PDFs, TIFFs, and various supplemental materials that, make up an item. So it wasn't always, if we renamed it to our typical convention, it's not, obvious as to what the item actually is. Is this a consent form? Is this the transcript? And so I initially wanted to tweak it to where I would have it to sort of stick to our convention, but maybe append a word or two as to what it was. But that proved to be too time consuming to do that, because you'd have to look at every file and rename every file individually. And that just wasn't a tenable solution. And the other reason we sort of chose to stick to our standards is that the original names wouldn't really matter, because we were the ultimate end user. So there would be no outside end user that would be expecting the original name. And so in that same vein, original order also didn't matter, because the work was done sort of by previous us, and it's, no one is expecting that original order. No one's going to come back and research how previous us, collected things. So we didn't think original order was important. So we thought it was better to stay consistent with how we structure our packages. And another question is how to keep track of the process. And by that, I mean, how do we, keep those checkpoints? And so if you remember previously, I discussed the processing log, but the processing log is really good to keep track of things once they're ready to be packaged and in the organization that we want them to be in. And so I wanted to make sure I kept track of the process before we even got to that point. And so the way I did that was I created a checklist for every step of the way that I would literally check as I went, and then also created an inventory log of content that was on the Drobo and content that was on the Access platform, and a way to sort of connect those. So I will talk about the inventory log in a few slides. So the goals of the project are to organize, package, and put all items represented in our current digital collections into preservation. And one thing to note is that since these collections were amassed over, almost a 20-year period, there was not a consistent organization, both from a file, folder standpoint and also from a naming standpoint. So each collection had its own sort of unique organization. And so the goal was to get that all into a flat file structure that we use as our standard. And this is the top level view of that Kelly backup share. Each number is the number of hard drive. So like 1 would be the first hard drive. And so you can see there's some consistency, but some inconsistency in just file naming on the top level. And the secondary goal was to discover and note materials that are not currently in our digital collections, but could be. So not everything that was on the Drobo made it to the Access platform. There was some extra material. And so it was my goal to sort of identify that and see, do we have the rights to this? Do we maybe want to add this to our collections? And so in that vein, I worked with our Access side of things, our digital creation librarian and our institutional repository librarian, to sort of see like, hey, this is sitting here. Do you think this might be beneficial? And sort of work through that question. All right, so here is, I'm big in diagrams and project planning. So here's the master workflow, and I will go through each stage individually. So the first stage is the appraisal stage. And by appraisal, I don't mean necessarily in the traditional archival sense, but it basically what it meant is that I would look at a collection and go to its folder on the Drobo and sort of see what is there, and is there extra stuff beyond what is in the Access platform. And if there was extra stuff, I would confer with our digital imaging manager, who, like I said, has been at UAB Libraries for quite some time, and she really has that institutional knowledge and was hands-on in the creation of these collections, and in many cases digitizing these collections. So she had that institutional knowledge to be able to say, oh, we digitized this, but we didn't have the rights to it, and things like that. So this is a screenshot of the top level of a letter collection from a renowned Proust scholar that taught at UAB. And so, you've got all these folders, but actually the only stuff that's in the access part, the actual digital collection, are these letters. So our digital imaging manager was able to say, for whatever reason, that's why we have this stuff, we can't use it, or we can. And then, so I would sort of filter out the stuff that we might use, and then get to work on the stuff that was actually in the digital collection. So the next stage is the planning stage. And this stage is just to work with our access side of things, to sort of figure out what they want to keep in DIP store, like I mentioned in the previous previous workflow. DIP store is where we keep temporary access copies of things. So just confer with them. And so a lot of collections, this is a top level of, I think, that same letter collection. It's one of the letter folders. A lot of collections are separated by file type. So you'd have, every letter would have its JPEGs in here. Every letter would have its PDFs. Every letter would have its TIFFs in here. And so I would get with the relevant access librarian and see what they wanted. In most cases, I typically, if we had TIFFs, I typically weeded the JPEGs because those were only generated for Content DM. If we had WAV files, I typically weeded the MP3s, but I would keep the PDFs of things, which is not something that we do from lab generated content if we generate PDFs. But in this case, it, small size, and it seemed relevant to keep them. So now the next stage is the organization stage, and this is really sort of the meat of the whole project. And first I'm going to talk about what I mean by organization. And so that basically means that every collection needed to be organized into one folder, or excuse me, every item in a collection needed to be organized into its own folder in a flat file structure. So that meant if I'm keeping the TIFFs and there are PDFs, I need to get them all in one folder. Once that was done, I would use some restructuring Python scripts to sort of get everything renamed. But that is the end goal of the organization. And like I mentioned in the last slide, there's more leeway here compared to lab generated objects in keeping access copies, because if we didn't have WAV files, we only had MP3 files, obviously I wasn't going to not keep those. So, and like I said, we kept PDFs. So a little more leeway there since these are legacy collections and there's no sense in throwing away that work. And I mentioned the inventory log a few slides ago, and this is a picture of a completed inventory log. The inventory log was changed dramatically from start to finish, processing each collection. So I would initially start with pulling down the title, on the access side of things, the title of an object. And then I would, one by one, look at the Drobo and connect the two. And once I connected the two, I would rename the folder on the Drobo to the access title name, and then I would also hyperlink to the access, the page on our access platform. And the inventory log is used by both myself to stay organized, but also the digital curation librarian would use those in assigning UUIDs to the metadata record. And I would also assign local IDs, and this information would be used once I eventually get to generating processing logs. And I also want to say that before I could get to the inventory log stage, I would have to make sure everything was in its own, every item had all its materials in its own folder. So now the actual organization. If files were interfiled within each other, things that I would get rid of, I would delete them just to get them out of the way. If they weren't, if say like I was getting rid of JPEGs and the JPEGs were off in their own folder, I would just ignore it. So then I would create the inventory log and reorganize the file structure and connect those contents. And this was sort of an iterative process, and it really changed depending on the collection. And then I would assign UUIDs, rename the files, and zip those access copies and upload them to our dip store. So these two images represent a PDF folder and a TIFF folder of the same exact collection. So this is a collection that's a namesake of one of our libraries, and he's a very prominent man in our community. And so you can see the PDF folder is very nicely, it's got a succession number and then a human readable sort of what is it. Then you go over to the TIFF folder and it's a bunch of numbers. And so a really fun part of this project was sort of solving that puzzle of, okay, how do these connect? And eventually I figured out that the first three numbers were the accession number and the last two numbers were like the number of like that. It was the first image or the second image of that item. So I was able to sort of use Python scripts to connect, a lot of single-use Python scripts to connect things like that and automate getting things in one folder. So now I mentioned those restructuring Python scripts. I'm going to talk about those scripts. So once everything is in its own folder, then I would use a few scripts to get things renamed. And the first script is called folder inventory loader. And it basically, you point the script at a directory where the folder of collection items is, and it generates the CSV. If you haven't learned by now, we love CSVs here. It generates the CSV with the directory path, the original folder name, and then a blank UUID field. And so once that's generated, I would input the UUIDs and save that CSV and put it into the next script, which is a folder and file renamer. And it basically takes that CSV, finds the folder based on the directory path, and renames it based on the UUID. So it renames all the folders, and then it reiterates back through and renames the file names. If you remember, it's a UUID underscore number. And so that basically gets it to the point where it's ready to be packaged for preservation. But before that, I needed to transfer the access copies, which in this case pretty much meant everything, to our dip store. And it was much easier to do that before I before I package for preservation. So this script zip bees. If you remember, I talked about derivative TIFFs. We would call those bees, so that's why it's called zip bees. It zips the contents of each folder in a directory that you pointed at, transfers them to the Synology dip store share, and it also has a capability of, I could say, like ignore txtx file extensions if the digital curation librarian didn't want those. And so now we have, excuse me. Now we get to preservation, which is pretty much the exact same as the previous workflow. So, excuse me, I got rid of a slide and forgot. So for preservation, I would, once everything is organized as it should be, I create the processing log, transfer relevant info from the inventory log, and fill that out. At this point, if the local ID was sort of in question, I would work with people in historical collections to sort of figure out what that would be. And then package the items with those scripts that I went over in the last workflow and upload them to relevant preservation locations and transfer them to the Synology production share to just have our local copy. And finally, is the documentation stage. So we have a Confluence wiki. So I would create for each collection a page that has both the typical item structure. So what you might expect to find, like futurists can expect to find, and then also talk about sort of how the local ID was sourced and then any notable exceptions. And then this stage also, our access librarians would add the UUIDs to their the metadata records of their platforms. So the project plan, I processed one collection at a time all the way through. I did one and then practiced to get an idea about the timing. And then from that, I created a weekly Gantt chart. And we also decided to process things in Alma Digital first, since the migration was coming up, and then work on our institutional repository. Just very quickly, here's the Gantt chart that I created, and that kept me on track. And then finally, some lessons learned. This might seem simple, but it's very important. Your work has ramifications for years to come. I can't tell you how often I went into Kelly's office and said, thank you for how you organized that collection 15 years ago when I was in middle school, because it really helped me today. So when you're thinking about workflows and thinking about just your day-to-day work and questions as simple as, how do I organize these files? That might have ramifications for someone 10 to 15 years down the road. So constantly be thinking about future you and future us. And then also, plan heavily now and benefit later. I did a lot of groundwork on project management and really made sure I did my due diligence before jumping in, and it's really paid dividends. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Grayson. Yeah, I like that finishing remark. Plan heavily now, benefit later. And I think kudos to Kelly, was it, who for having the foresight to back up this stuff. I see there's been a couple of questions going in the chat, both I think from Dan in Ohio State. One of which was about dealing with born digital materials, but I think that's been picked up by your colleague, Luke. So Dan had a follow-up question about the Confluence pages you just described. And he's asking, are they created by script or are they hand created in each case?
So those are hand created. I'm sure I could figure out a way to script them. I'm pretty new to Confluence, and I know there's a way to create templates and whatnot, but honestly, what I would do is I created one, and then once I got to the next, finish the next collection, I would just copy paste and fill in the relevant info. It was a manageable enough project to where automating that wasn't really super beneficial, but I would imagine if you're trying to do that at scale with a large amount of collections, probably could try to automate it, at least automate generating it in a different software and then importing it into Confluence.
Okay. Well, I have another question for you there, which is, did you ever think and then abandon the idea of just basically taking a disk image, either of the portable drives or the Nobo, just so that if anything goes wrong, you subsequently find the future you discovers you've made a mistake, you could at least kind of roll back to that stage in the workflow and perhaps re-ingest it again?
I never considered that. That's a good idea. I'm not sure how large those hard drives are and how large those disk images would be. But no, I didn't consider that. I guess I didn't think about future me, even though I said that was one of my points.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you've got quite a sort of rigorous workflow there. So hopefully future you will be perfectly happy with what you've done.